Hello, and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and today we'll be talking with Moshe Cohen. Moshe is a professor and a senior lecturer at Boston University, where he teaches negotiation and mediation. He is also the author of this fantastic book, Collywobbles: How to Negotiate When Negotiating Makes You Nervous. I spent the last couple of days reading this book from cover to cover, and I'm really delighted to be able to have a deep dive with Moshe about the power that emotions have when it comes to our negotiation. We often don't talk about this. We often talk about the strategies and the approaches, and we forget that what lurks behind driving our decision-making are our emotions. So we're going to have a really deep dive, real good chat about this. So if you're interested in what's really going on under the bonnet when you're negotiating, join us on this podcast. Hello and welcome to the show. We have Moshe Cohen here, and I'm really pleased to have him on the show. I've been following him on LinkedIn for a while. Before we jump in, Moshe, why don't you share a little bit about who you are for our listeners and what it is that you do?
Thank you, Tony. Hi, my name is Moshe. I'm a mediator and a negotiation teacher and a university lecturer based here in Boston, Massachusetts. I've been doing things in this field since about 1995, and I work both in the private sector and in the university.
Thank you. So let's get to know a little bit about you first. We've got your book in front of me, and I've read it from cover to cover. I bought it on just before I went to the UK for my Christmas holidays, and I was sick. I was in bed for 4 days, and it was great because I had 4 days of no disturbance to read your book. So we're really going to dive into that later on. But I'd like to know about you. You started, you said, around 1995, and one of the things that you do is you describe yourself as somebody who unlocks the potential for people to negotiate and deal with conflict. Do you think that we all have potential to become good negotiators?
So, first of all, I'm sorry you were sick, but I'm glad you read the book. Yeah, I mean, if you look at kids, right, children are marvelous negotiators. And they have to negotiate with their parents, with their siblings, with their friends, with each other from a very young age. And if you've ever observed kids in a playground, or, I have 4 children, so I've got to observe my kids negotiating with each other, you see that everybody has the potential to advocate for themselves, to collaborate, to compete, all the things that we teach in negotiation, kids do naturally. So I think that we all do have that potential. What I think happens is that later in life, some of that starts getting suppressed. We start getting very self-conscious about what we're doing, and our emotional responses start getting in the way of our ability to access those things that we did so naturally as kids. One example I give in the book is that, kids have no problem asking their parents for money or for more allowance. But when we get older, asking our boss for a raise is something that gives us a tummy ache. So something changes, but yeah, I think we all have that potential.
And so what kind of experiences do you have, or how do people react to you when you want to help them unlock this potential?
So, I mean, it depends on the setting. As a teacher, what I try to do is I try to put people through experiences that help them come up against these things on their own. And then we use the discussion or conversation that follows from that to help them figure out what they're trying to do, why it's difficult, what's getting in the way, and what they can do differently given who they are. The way people respond to it usually is immense relief, because very often people come to me and say, "Oh, I'm a bad negotiator." And I don't know what that means, right? And very often what people mean by that is that they find themselves very challenged by certain kinds of negotiation. And very often they refer to the ones about advocating for themselves, negotiating for a big purchase like as a car or a house, or very much career-related stuff, advocating for themselves at work. And what they mean is that they struggle when it comes to promoting their own interests. And what I find is that if you engage people in conversation, you find that they're not bad negotiators, is that they have skills and personality traits that make them very effective in certain circumstances and less effective in other
Mm.
circumstances. So by first of all, helping them see that they're already effective, but they're not giving themselves credit for those areas where they
Mm.
are effective, then helping them carry over some of those skills to those areas where they're less comfortable, they feel an immense sense of relief, realizing that they've been doing these things. They just have been thinking very much differently about those situations where they're
Mm.
not doing as well.
Mm. Yeah, I guess it's like when you hear people say, "Oh, I'm terrible at sports," and you think, "Well, wait a minute, sports. There's a huge gamut of different sports. You can't be bad at every sport, right? There might be just one area. Maybe you played football at school and you were bad at football, but there's loads of other sports, right?
Right. You might be a brilliant table tennis player, right? I
Right.
mean, some people have great hand-eye coordination. Some people have great balance. Different people are good at different things.
Yeah.
And I think that putting a label on yourself as
Mm.
being bad at something is just generally not helpful.
Why do you think that negotiation has? It feels like it's like it's had a bad rap. It feels when I talk to people about negotiation, they'll either move into competitive mode and want to challenge me and know what do you know about negotiation, or they'll back off and say no, I don't like to negotiate about things. Why do you think that negotiations had such a bad rap over the years?
So I think people confuse negotiation and bargaining. And I think people see negotiation very much as the macho competitive
Hmm.
context that and there's the analogy to sports again. It's about winning and losing, and you see, in fact, you see so many books about here's how to win in negotiation,
Right.
and that creates a level of discomfort for people, because they don't want to see themselves in that light.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I think people are very fearful of ending up on the wrong side of that. They're fearful that something bad will happen if they try to negotiate, which creates a lack of confidence and a discomfort with the whole process. And
Hmm.
that's where you get that second response of, no, 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 that's not
Hmm.
something I'm, want to engage in.
And so for you, can you pinpoint at what point in time this became something that you decided you were going to dedicate your life to? Did something happen? Did you see something?
So yes, actually, there was a specific, precise moment in my case. So I was an engineer in my prior life. And at some point, I decided I didn't want to stay an engineer and wanted to move into management. So I enrolled in an MBA program at Boston University. And as part of the MBA program, I took a negotiation class because I considered myself to be a bad negotiator. And in that class, two things happened. One, we did our first graded negotiation, and I got the highest grade in the class. And it changed my self-perception to think, okay, maybe I'm not as bad as I think I am. But then the second thing that happened is we did a unit on mediation, and I got to play the mediator in a role play, and I fell in love with it. I went to my professor right after that role play, and I said, I didn't know this was a thing. This is me. This is who I've been all my life, but nobody told me that this was something you could actually do. How do I get into this?
Hmm.
And he gave me some names, and I called people, and I got a basic mediation training, and that's kind of how I moved into this field. I was a mediator for about a year, and realized that mediators have a very, very hard time feeding their families, and that most mediators do things in addition to their mediation practice. So for me, the natural thing to do was to start teaching negotiation because I've
Sure.
always been teaching in some capacity, and that's kind of how it all happened.
So how in your mind, if there is one, how do you differentiate between like mediation between warring factions and a negotiation between a company, perhaps a merger or a takeover?
Oh, there are some concepts that carry over, but there's also, I think, immense differences.
Mm.
The concepts that carry over is that people are fundamentally negotiating to meet some interests. And if you can uncover what those interests are and have people discuss resolution that might meets both sets of interests, it's possible to come to solutions in both contexts. The international context is actually much more complicated because when you're dealing with companies, very often you're dealing with a very small group of individuals who have the decision-making power. When you're dealing with the international context where there's, warring factions or countries, the bigger negotiations actually are occurring within each side more than across the table on the other side. That people are worried about their own political standing within their countries. People are worried about, will they stay in power or will some other faction displace them? And what you essentially have is multi-group negotiations on both sides of the table that very often tie people's hands when it comes to negotiating across the table with the other side. And very often those negotiations get stuck because
Yeah.
each side is looking over their shoulder at their own people, wondering what they can do without getting in trouble.
That's a really good point, and I think a lot of people don't actually take that into consideration when people are negotiating and the results and the process is being spread all over the news. It's in the public eye, and so there's an added pressure, isn't there, of having to negotiate for results when not only you've got people in your team watching, but you're in the public eye as well. Everyone can see what happens, whether it's a company or whether it's a country. That there's an added pressure there, I guess.
Right. I mean, that's why you see in many cases where there was successful mediation, that there was the very visible negotiation
Right,
that took place in the public eye, but there was also a second tier negotiation
right,
that took place behind the scenes, and that's what really resolved the issue.
right. Yeah. So Moshe, let's dive into this book. I have to congratulate you on something which was, it hit me as soon as I opened the book and started reading it. And it's what I've written here is, I love the unapologetic focus that you have on the negative and positive influence that emotions have on negotiations. Um, I've read many books and I've done many courses, and very few have actually really taken on the challenge of dealing with that shadow, that thing that goes on, that's in the background, always there, which is how you're feeling about the negotiation, about the other person, about yourself. And I really, really congratulate you on doing this. What made you take that big, brave step to focus 100% on emotions?
Um, I didn't feel it was brave at the time. I sometimes like to say that I wrote a self-help book for myself, and I was struggling with these issues. I
Right,
noticed that, for example, as a mediator, I have really good skills. But then when I have to negotiate at home, say with my wife, my ability to use my skills goes way down. I shut down.
right.
So I started to, and I saw that in my students, right? I see that my students very often have very good skills when we do practice negotiations in class, but then they go to negotiate with their coworker and they get tongue-tied or they get anxious. So I came to the conclusion that it wasn't our skill, there was something in the way.
Hmm.
Started thinking about what's getting in the way. And what I came to the conclusion about myself, for example, is that on one hand, I have great skills. On the other hand, I'm very emotionally volatile. I get reactive. I get overwhelmed. I get angry. I get excited. And when I get into those states, my ability to think rationally, my ability to respond rather than react emotionally goes way down.
Hmm.
And I started thinking that if we had a way of managing those emotional responses in real time, then we could actually gain more access to the skills that we naturally bring to the table.
Hmm.
Sometimes you've heard this, that people say, oh, let's leave our emotions at the door. I find that I'm just incapable of doing that. They keep following me into the room. And I realized you can't pretend that emotions don't exist. You can't suppress them or eliminate them. You need to acknowledge them and manage them in real time so they're still there, but they're not running the show. So
Hmm.
that was my goal in the book. And that's kind of how it came about. I realized that we were being ineffective. And every year another set of books would come out
Yeah.
teaching us more skills and strategies, and they
Yeah.
were great. And there was no point in writing another one of those. But unless we can manage our emotions, we can't use any of those skills and strategies they're teaching us. So I thought what's missing is this idea that we need to manage the barriers to success
Right.
while also learning the skills and techniques.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where you and I, our interests cross heavily, because I teach emotionally intelligent negotiation,
Mhm.
and the idea of being able to first understand in real time the effect your emotions are having on the situation, and then channel them effectively. Um, it's not novel. It's a very old idea, but it's just so difficult to do. And I like in your book where what you've done is you've gone a step further, and you said there's a fear, and you talk about the tension that exists between risk and opportunity. Can you expand a little bit on that, on what we fear we might lose versus what we could potentially gain?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I really love that you were working in a very similar kind of vein, because I don't think enough people focus on those things. And as you correctly point out, the cornerstone of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. So if once you start becoming more aware of what's going on with you, then you have the ability to start doing stuff with it. And why do people negotiate? People generally negotiate because they want something, or they're trying to achieve some goals or interests through that process. And that's where the opportunity comes in, right? If I'm negotiating, let's say, for a promotion, I see an opportunity in getting a more interesting, more lucrative job. Or if I'm negotiating for a house purchase, I'm looking for the opportunity of living in a different house. And at the same time, I think people live very much with the fear of negotiations going wrong. And when you look at fears in negotiation, you can classify them into sort of three major areas. One is a fear of tangible hurt.
Hmm.
Something bad will actually happen, right? If I ask my boss for a raise, I'll get fired, or something of that nature. The second one is a fear of relationship damage. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I want to ask my boss for this, project, but I'm afraid of damaging the relationship. And what I tell them is that if you can damage your relationship by asking your boss for this project, there's already a problem with that
Right.
relationship, right? And the chances that'll happen are minuscule, but our fear of damaging relationships is so much higher than the probability of us actually damaging those relationships. And the third fear is of emotional pain, right? If I ask my boss for a promotion, my boss will laugh at me and I'll cry. So we tend to move away from pain.
Hmm.
We tend to move away from fear. So if we're afraid of tangible hurt, relationship damage, or emotional pain, that shows up in our behavior. And probably, and I'm curious to hear from your experience, the biggest way it shows up is avoidance. If
Hmm.
I'm afraid something is going to happen if I negotiate, then I just avoid negotiating. I won't ask for that thing that I want, or I'll procrastinate or delay asking for that thing that I want. The second phenomenon I see is that, okay, finally I've gotten the courage to go do this, but I'm so fearful that I rush through it. I try to talk as quickly as I can and get the conversation over as quickly as I can because I'm afraid that calamity is going to hit. And the third thing that happens is people give up too easily and give away things they don't need to give
Yeah.
away just for the purpose of appeasing the other party or allaying the fear of something bad happening.
Hmm.
Fears aren't bad. Fears are normal. Like all humans have fears. Squirrels, cats have fears. It's part of what keeps you from running into the street.
Hmm.
When you let the fears dominate and define your behavior in those ways, that's when it can cause real damage. And, by being aware of what you're afraid might happen, you then at least have a chance of being able
Hmm.
to manage those behaviors and negotiate well despite them. And that's
You,
the goal.
you give such, there's a really lovely line that you use, and I'm going to use it many, many more times. I will quote you when I do use it, though. You said, we must learn to negotiate from the eye of the storm. And that's such a great metaphor, right? When everything around you is going crazy, and if you have that ability to just, even though things are going crazy around you, the ability to just be aware of what's going on in real time and channel your emotions effectively. I mean, that's a really powerful tool. I guess it takes a lifetime to be able to build that skill set.
I think it does. I don't necessarily know that I always have it.
Yeah.
Despite all the work I've done, I can still get overwhelmed. I can still get upset. I can still get excited or angry. So I think we're all, first of all, a work in progress.
Mm.
And you're not looking to achieve perfection. You're looking to negotiate a little better tomorrow than you did yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And if your ability to manage your emotions, brings them from here to here, well, you haven't brought them down to here, but you're already way better off than you were.
Right. Right.
So, I think that some of that eye of the storm stuff is very individual and very aspirational for a lot of people. What I really mean by that, though, is that you need to slow down. That when you feel overwhelmed, you can't continue negotiating out of that overwhelmed feeling. You've got to recognize that and manage your emotions down to the point where you can respond rather than react to the situation.
Mm.
And, for somebody, that might mean breathe for 10 seconds. For somebody else, that might mean disengage and come up. Disengage and come back to the conversation at another time. Different people will respond to that, in different ways and get there in different ways. But the concept of it's sort of like, I'll give you another sports analogy. You can't throw a ball or hit a tennis ball when you're off balance. You have to sort of first regain your footing and then throw or hit the ball when you are in a stable
Mm.
kind of place. And that's the same kind of thing you're trying to do. You're trying to create a balance in your own mind so you're not falling backwards as you try to respond to the other
Mm.
party.
So when I was reading this book, unfortunately, I'm the type of person that I highlight pages and I write on pages. I'm sorry, but
You're
so I
both.
can't I can't lend my book to other people. How do you, when you wrote this book, how did you want people to use it?
So what I first want people to do is just kind of read it through and take from it whatever is most relevant to them in
Mm.
terms of, the concepts, the ideas, the thoughts that that very few other people have really talked about, right? So for some people, like chapter 6 is my favorite chapter. It's all about narrative. It's what's your story, right?
Story, yeah.
What are you telling yourself as you negotiate? For me, that was huge. For somebody else, it might be more the emotional response curve, sort of, bringing down your emotional response so you can respond rather than react. So what I want people first to do is to like look at it and see what's relevant for them. But then, at the end of every chapter, I put sort of highlights from that chapter. I
Hmm.
want people
Hmm.
to be able to go back and reference that and say, okay, this is going to be a living document for me.
Yeah.
That when I encounter a situation where I don't know what to say, I can go to that chapter on, what to say when you don't know what to say, or what to do when you don't know what to do.
Right, right.
Um, and I'm hoping that by structuring it the way I did, it actually can function in both ways, where it enlightens and highlights some ideas that people might not have thought about and increases their self-awareness. And then on the other hand, gives them some practical tools they can go back to.
Mm. You mentioned chapter 6 actually. Let's talk about that. Expand on when you say the narrative, the story. Can you expand on what you mean by how that affects how we show up in a negotiation?
Oh, absolutely. So I think as humans, we tell ourselves stuff all the time. We tell
Mm.
ourselves stuff about ourselves, about the other person, and about the situation. So for example, if I go into a negotiation and I think, oh, I'm new at this, I've never done this before, and this person I'm negotiating with is an expert and I don't have a chance, that becomes very self-fulfilling, right? Because I now negotiate with no confidence at all. So what I've told myself now determines how I approach the situation, how I behave. And the things we tell ourselves have an incredible impact on what we do, how we feel, and how we interact with other people. So if I come in thinking, well, we're holding all the cards in this situation, I might come into that negotiation arrogant and unprepared, and
Mm.
then put myself in a very vulnerable position to the other person. So, and it all stems from the narrative. It all stems from what I tell myself. And I think we're not very aware of what we're
Yeah.
telling ourselves all the time. When I coach people in negotiations, a lot of times I'll like stop them and I'm like, all right, what are you telling yourself right now?
Mm.
And as soon as people slow down and ask themselves that question, it's incredible what insight that gives them because they realize that this thing that they've been telling themselves is now having this huge impact on the way they're negotiating. So when I work with people on this, I run them through four questions. The first one is, what are you telling yourself to make them more aware of what their narrative is? The second question is, what's the impact of your narrative? Sometimes we have narratives, but they're not that important. Sometimes the impact of the narrative is
Mm.
actually critical to how we're negotiating. The third question is, what do you actually know? What data or facts
Data.
do you have that are driving this narrative? And the answer very often is not much. We make this stuff up mostly.
Mm.
When somebody comes to me and says, oh, well, I can't ask for this, they'll never agree to that. I'm like, really? How do you know? And it's not that they know the other person will never agree. They're afraid the other person won't agree.
That's
And
great.
fear is creating this narrative, but they don't actually know that, and they won't know until they ask.
Mm.
And then the fourth thing, which I think is the crux of the whole thing, is that these narratives aren't real. They reside entirely in your mind. Even ones that are based on real facts still reside in your mind. And that's a great thing because you own them. It's your narrative. You get to change it. So then the question is, how can you become the author rather than the victim of your own narrative?
Love it. Yeah. I really loved that chapter so much. And but you even went before, if you remember, you started, you said that before we're born, we have a story, right? So even before we have a story, there's a story, right? Can you explain that?
That is actually my favorite section of that
Right.
chapter too. It's called On the Origin of Stories. And it starts by saying, in the beginning,
Right.
long before you were born, there was already a story about you. You know, our picture of ourselves is something that we didn't create in a vacuum. Our families, our society, our culture, there are lots of influences that fed us stories before we had the conscious ability to decide what stories we wanted to have. And again, some of those stories existed before we were born. Our parents had us for some reason, right?
Yeah.
So there were stories that existed then, but then from a very young age, we are fed stories about ourselves. All right. So, for example, I'm named after my father's brother who was killed fighting in World War II. And, you know, my father told me stories about his brother. And growing up, I felt like I needed to somehow honor this
Mm.
person's life. I needed to somehow be good enough to represent them currently. And so that wasn't the story I created. That was the story someone gave me. I then did something with it, but I did it before I was old enough to really know what I was doing. And what happens is over time, the stories that were created for us become internalized in our mind and become our stories. But that doesn't mean they necessarily serve us well. And if, let's say, I was told the story that I always need to be aggressive because that's how real men are, I wasn't, but let's pretend. That becomes my story, but that might actually really hurt my ability to work collaboratively within my
Mm.
organization. And then at some point, you're an adult and you get to look at your stories and say, okay, which one of these do I want to keep? And which ones of these are not really serving my interests and I want to either discard or change? And that's a really tough process, but it's a very worthwhile process. Now, you know, in the context of Collywobbles, I'm really focusing on the negotiation context. So, you know, if someone tells me that I always have to be nice, and now I'm unable to self-advocate as a negotiator, I get to question that narrative and to say, is there necessarily a contradiction between being nice
Mm.
and being tough when I need to be? Because I can be nice, but also be tough. Fisher and Urey in Getting to Yes said, separate the people from the problem. Be soft on the people, hard on the problem. All right. And that's an example of someone being very nice on the people side, but very tough on the substantive side.
Right, right.
Now, I can rewrite that narrative in my mind to say, I've created a false dichotomy between being nice and being effective. I don't have to have that
Mm.
dichotomy. I can be a good person. I can be nice. I can be kind, and yet be very principled and very strong when it comes to the substance of my negotiation. And that comes from first recognizing, what am I telling myself, and what do I want to be telling myself to be the kind of person I want to be and the kind of negotiator I want to be.
Yeah, I mean, reading your book, when I was coming to the end, I said to myself, this isn't a negotiation book. I mean, this is a life book. This is it delves into you as a person, what makes you, what allows you to show up as you show up in terms of your communication style. And it gives you the opportunity to do a real deep dive and make some decisions about who you are moving forward. And I really congratulate you on kind of weaving that into a negotiation book.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
the one last kind of point I wanted to touch on, there's so many points, Moshe, and I knew in half an hour we wouldn't fit everything in, but I loved also where you touched upon the ability to be able to walk away, the power in walking away. Would you share with us some of your insights in walking away in a negotiation?
Yeah. So whoever needs a resolution less tends to have more leverage and power in a negotiation. Right? If we're negotiating, and for you, this negotiation is a nice to have, for me, it's absolutely critical, then you have more power than I do in this negotiation. So unless you can get yourself into the frame of mind where under some circumstances you are willing and able to walk away from the negotiation, you're essentially corralling yourself into a situation where you have to come to an agreement. And once you feel like you have to come to an agreement, you become very disempowered. The other person can keep pushing you and you'll keep giving in until they've decided that it's good enough for them. And now you're coming to an agreement on their terms. So you always can walk away. I mean, in every negotiation, there's always the chance that you'll walk away, but there's costs and there's benefits from walking away. And very often we are so fearful of those costs that while we can walk away, we aren't willing to.
Hmm.
And that's where the emotional side comes in. And in the plane, in the book, I call it jumping out of the plane.
Same, yeah.
Because yeah, you know, the concept of jumping out of the plane is fine when you're on the ground, but when you're now 3,000 meters in the air and you have to jump out of the plane, well, that's a completely different proposition. Yes, you're still able to technically, but are you willing to?
Right, right. And the skill
So,
set, right? You've practiced pulling the ripcord so many times and you've done it several times. And now you have to do exactly the same thing, but 10,000 feet above, it suddenly is a different proposition, right?
and once again, it's on the emotional realm, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Technically, you know what to do,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
all emotions.
Yeah.
So before you negotiate, you need to sit down and imagine that it didn't work out and think about what the world looks like at that point.
Mm.
And very often, when you first look at it, it'll seem like the end of the world. But then as you sit with that longer, you realize it's not great, but it's also not the end of the world.
Yeah.
And you can start thinking about, what are my red lines? What are my limits? That if I don't get these things, I will actually walk away. And what am I going to do when I walk away to minimize the damage and create as much opportunity for myself, right?
Mm.
Because, negotiated solutions aren't always your best choice. Sometimes you have a better alternative. If I'm negotiating with an employer, but I've got a better job offer from another employer, I might choose to walk away.
Yeah. And you talk about this as well. This is it's quite a dangerous concept when we talk about walk away. You talk about playing chicken, right? If both parties are pretending that they're prepared to walk away and they're bluffing, then you get into the realms of having challenging conversations, and then having what you call an impasse in the book.
Right. So this isn't so much about, fluffing your feathers and claiming that you're excited to walk away.
Right.
This is more internal and fundamental, being ready to walk away if you need to. In some ways, you want to think of it almost as walking away with a certain amount of sadness that you weren't able to do this, but not a fear of walking away either. So, of course you can walk away, but threatening the other person by saying, oh, well, I guess I'm out of here,
Right.
is very often going to elicit the exact response from them. And then you've got impasse in a situation where both parties might be actually better off by taking away the facade and actually talking about how to create something better for themselves.
That's really another really good point. I just want to highlight the difference between claiming that you are going to walk away or actually being ready to walk away. Again, the emotions are different, right?
Yeah. I think being ready to walk away gives you the confidence to negotiate and actually to take more risks in the negotiation. Negotiations are risky. I don't know if you're going to negotiate in good faith. I don't know if you're going to carry out your agreements. I don't know if you're going to present me with some information during the negotiation that is going to overwhelm me or put me at a disadvantage. There's a lot of risks, but knowing that if it doesn't work out, here's what I'm going to do instead, and knowing under what circumstances I'm going to walk away and do that gives me the confidence to have riskier conversations with you, because I know I'm going to be okay either way.
Moshe, sorry. I wish I could go on forever with this. You're the type of person that I would kind of love to be on a plane with, and then the pilots say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have a 14-hour delay and the plane is not moving. Please bear with us. And I'm sat next to you and I'm like, well, fantastic. Let's just have a bottle of wine together and let's continue this conversation.
That would be lovely. And I feel the same way. This is one of those conversations that I also wish could go on a lot longer.
To finish off, Moshe, would you just let us know how can our listeners, how can they find you, and what is it that you are working on at the moment that if they wanted to connect with you, they could help you with?
So probably the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. Just look for Moshe Cohen Negotiation, and I usually pop up pretty close to the top. People are always welcome to email me as well. It's just Moshe, M-O-S-H-E, @negotiatingtable.com. And in terms of the biggest help is, I self-published Collywobbles, and it's gotten a very nice reception, but not enough people in the world know about it. And if people do take a look at the book and they like it, the biggest thing they could do is let all their friends know, put it on their social media, and just help me spread the word about it.
Moshe, well, I'm definitely one of your fans. This book has really helped me, and I'll be using this as one of my negotiation compendiums moving forward. Thank you very much for joining us at Empathy at the Table. Thank you, Moshe.
Thank you, Tony, for inviting me. It's been delightful.
Thank you. Once again, I'd like to thank Moshe for joining us on the podcast. Moshe, it was a real pleasure. Look forward to catching up with you again. Please connect with Moshe. You have his LinkedIn profile, which will be in the bio. And if you haven't read the book, go out there, get this book, Collywobbles, How to Negotiate When Negotiating Makes You Nervous. Please give us a like and don't forget to subscribe. See you on our next episode of Empathy at the Table.